Obviously, all of you know me, but I'll introduce myself anyway. My name is Dawson Rush, and I serve as the interim pastor here at the McClave Community Christian Church, and I'm excited to see each and every one of you here today as we continue on with our series, I Am Jesus in His Own Words. And the heart of this series really came from looking around our culture and seeing all of these narratives or ideas about who Jesus of Nazareth was and is, right? And these ideas are being formed not by a biblical or a scriptural witness, but rather by a political bias or some other worldview that's looking at Jesus and coming to a conclusion about him. And again, at the first sermon of this series, I showed a video of kind of interviewing people about who do you think Jesus is? And the variety of answers in that video were just fascinating. Like, there seems to be no clear consensus about who Jesus was. And so the goal of this series is to look at 5 times in the Gospel of John where Jesus, using this I am formula, talks directly about how he sees himself, his life, his purpose. And our goal is that by looking at these statements, we would come to a more consensus view about who Jesus is. And in order to do this well, I've asked, as we walk through this series, that we all agree on 2 really important things. First, that despite the theological motivations of John, the author of our gospel, we're going to give his work the benefit of the doubt, in that when he says Jesus said something, that's what Jesus said, right? That John has accurately and correctly recorded the words of Jesus without error. If we fail to do this and give the Bible its fair shake as a historical document about the historical person of Jesus, then we're not going to get a very good actual view of Jesus, because we're approaching it with so much skepticism that there's really nothing that we can learn. And then secondly, we're going to evaluate the words that Jesus says in the cultural context that he said them. If we try and understand Jesus' words primarily through a 21st century lens and not a 1st century lens, again, we're going to get skewed results, because things just aren't going to make as much sense to us. And this passage is a great example, right? Because 1st century sheep farming looks a lot different than the way that we raise animals here in the 21st century. All right, so why the heck is Jesus so obsessed with dying and his death? There's this really popular show called The Chosen that's out there. It kind of chronicles the life of Jesus. And I've never watched the whole show, but I've seen clips from it. And it's like Jesus in the show is really quippy. Like he kind of talks in that modern Hollywood, he's always got a one-liner almost, it feels like, for everything. And what always fascinated me as I would read the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, is that Jesus, over and over again, 3 separate times, he tells the disciples, oh, by the way, we're going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be put to death. But I'm going to rise from the dead, but I'm going to die. And then in the Gospel of John, we have this theme of the hour, right? And so whenever you're reading the Gospel of John and we hear about Jesus' hour, we're always referencing his death in Jerusalem on the cross. And how early does this theme show up in the book? In the 2nd chapter. The 2nd chapter of John, Jesus is at a wedding in Cana, and they've just run out of wine. And his mother approaches Jesus with this problem. She says, Jesus, they've run out of wine at the wedding. Isn't that terrible for them? And Jesus' response to her, he says, Mom, what is that to me? My hour has not come. And so Jesus is at a wedding, and what is he doing? He's thinking about and meditating on his eventual death. And I read that, we're 2 chapters in, and Jesus is talking about his death. It almost feels like Jesus is kind of a morbid guy to be around, for the disciples. He's constantly talking about his death. And so why? Why is Jesus so obsessed with his hour, with his death? Well, I think here in this passage we get a better glimpse into why that is. And so as we walk through these verses, what we're going to see is that Jesus is the good shepherd who is sacrificed to save the sheep. Jesus is the good shepherd who is sacrificed to save the sheep. All right, so before we jump into our verses, as always, let's set the context. So as a reminder, Jesus is speaking to a group of gathered people in Jerusalem, and there's been significant controversy over Jesus healing this man who was born blind. You see, the healing occurred on the Sabbath, and so the Pharisees are really upset because they think Jesus has broken the law by healing on the Sabbath, and so they are determined to prove that the healing was false, that it did not happen, but they've been unable to do so. I mean, everything that they've seen has confirmed the fact that there was a man who was born blind, that he can now see, and that Jesus is the one who opened his eyes. And so as a result, in anger, they kick the man that was born blind out of the local synagogue, out of the church. And then he goes and he finds Jesus again, and he confesses that he believes Jesus is the Messiah, and it says he worships him. Now, Jesus then begins teaching on a variety of points, and in all of these points there's a central through line, and that is first century sheep farming, right? So again, it's not a narrative, it's not a parable, but it's a sustained use of a singular metaphor, sheep farming, to prove a couple of different points. And last week we saw Jesus kind of chastising and rebuking those who falsely proclaim themselves religious leaders and messiahs, but who actually harm God's people instead of saving them and leading them. And he declared that he is the gate. In other words, the only way to be saved and experience this abundant and eternal life is by entering through Jesus as the gate. And so here we see Jesus continuing his teaching to this group of people. Look with me now at chapter 10, verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. All right, so Jesus says he's not just a shepherd, but he's the good shepherd. Now, in the commentary that I'm working from as I work through the Gospel of John, it's D.A. Carson's commentary on John, brilliant scholar, D.A. Carson. And he feels the need in the commentary, he takes time in his writing to kind of explain our kind of cultural misconception about shepherds, right? He says we often think of shepherds as almost these kind of like lowly and maybe even almost kind of effeminate men, and their arms are full of cuddly lambs, and it's so cute and easy. And how that's not at all accurate to the reality of first century shepherding. And I had to laugh as I was reading that because I was thinking to myself, I don't need to explain that to my congregation because the vast majority of you in here have in some way or shape in your lives been involved in the production and care of livestock. And you are aware that it is not all cute and cuddly. But that it's dirty, it's difficult, it's physical, it's taxing work. It's not easy, and sometimes it can even be dangerous. Now, the word that Jesus uses to describe himself as the shepherd is the Greek word kalos. And it can mean a couple of different things. D.A. Carson says that maybe instead of good, a little bit better of a translation would be worthy or noble. It's not just that I'm a good shepherd at my job, but it's that I'm a noble shepherd in how I do my job. I'm a worthy shepherd in how I do my job. It's not just that I'm good at it, but it's how I go about being good at it. And what makes the shepherd noble? That he lays down his life for the sheep. Does Jesus mean here that he's simply prepared to die to protect his flock? Well, it seems like it's much deeper than that, because it's not just that the shepherd dies, it's that the shepherd lays down their life. Like there's an intentional choosing of the death here by the shepherd. In other words, the shepherd could choose not to lay down his life and sacrifice the flock to whatever the danger is, but that's not the case. It said that the shepherd is choosing, willfully choosing, to lay down his life in protection of the flock. And it's not just that he dies, but it's why he dies. Again, D.A. Carson in his commentary gives a humorous example. It's not as though the shepherd is throwing himself off a cliff and looking back up towards the sheep looking down at him as he falls down the cliff going, see how much I love you. Like, that's not what's happening here at all. Rather, the idea is that the sheep are in this true mortal danger. I mean, they are in incredible peril, and that only the death of the shepherd can spare them from this fate. That there's nothing else that can save the sheep but the death of the shepherd. All right, look with me now at verses 12 and 13. He who is a hired hand and is not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters the flock. He flees because he is a hired hand and does not care about the sheep. Okay, so here we have a new character introduced to the image, and it's this hired hand. Now, the hired hand works with the shepherd, and he's happy to take care of the sheep as long as he's getting his paycheck. But the second that this mortal danger to the sheep comes around, I mean, he's out of there. And really, he can't do anything to protect the sheep in this instance. So again, it seems that Jesus is referencing the religious leaders like the Pharisees, right? These people who are claiming to offer salvation for the people, but are actually powerless to save anyone. Their message of be good enough and you'll enter into God's grace is not saving anyone. If you just follow the law perfectly and you'll enter into this abundant eternal life, Jesus has already established that that is not the case. They can't do it. You can't law yourself into righteousness. It will never, ever, ever work. And so it's that these hired hands, they think they're trying to save the sheep, but they're actually powerless to save the sheep. Verses 14 and 15. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Okay, we have this repetition, right, of I am the good shepherd. Again, that's how, whenever Jesus repeats something, it's probably because he's really serious about that point, right? So Jesus is really trying to drive home the point here. And then we have a reference to our passage from last week where Jesus says, I know my own and my own know me, right? And we saw this happening. So Jesus, as the shepherd, he approaches this fold or pen of the sheep, and he calls his sheep out by name, and they know his voice and they follow him. And so there's this intimate knowledge of the sheep with the shepherd and vice versa. But even further, right, now we have Jesus saying that the love and intimacy that he has with his flock is only rivaled, like the only other thing he can think to compare it to is the intimate relationship that he has with God the Father as God the Son. Like, that is how deep our relationship with Jesus as our shepherd, as our Messiah, as our leader is meant to be. That it is rivaled only by the relationship that Jesus, God the Son, has with Yahweh, God the Father. Like, that is how much closeness and intimacy and love exists in this relationship. And then again, we have this repetition of, I'm going to lay down my life for the sheep. Verse 16. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. Okay, so who are the sheep that Jesus is going to die for? Who are the people that Jesus is going to save? Well, last week we had one fold of sheep introduced, right? Jesus said there's this fold, I'm going to call people out of it. But now Jesus is saying there's a secondary fold. And that out of these two separate folds will become one flock, all following Jesus. What does Jesus mean by this? Well, the first fold is Jews, and the second fold is us, Gentiles. And that God is going to call all of us together to become one messianic flock, united by the grace and work and love of Jesus Christ, the shepherd. Verse 17. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it back. Okay, so again, we have a little bit of a further explanation of Jesus laying down his life, and now he says he's going to take it back. And he says that this is why the Father loves him. Now, I want to be really cautious here, right? This isn't as though God the Father didn't love God the Son until the moment of his death. Like, that's not at all what Jesus is saying here. Rather, God the Father has always perfectly loved God the Son because God the Son has always been perfectly obedient to the will of God the Father. In other words, whenever God the Father has asked God the Son to do something, the Son has always done it obediently, perfectly. And because of that, God has always loved him perfectly. And so the reason that we're highlighting him laying down his life as why God the Father loves him is because that is the ultimate culmination of that obedience, right? Like, a lot of the things that God the Father has asked God the Son to do have been just relatively in the moment of creation. We say that God speaks into creation and that Jesus is his word that works as the agent of creation, right? But here God is saying, I need you to die. God the Father says to God the Son, you have to die. And God the Son says, not my will, but yours. It's that perfect obedience. That is why God the Father has always perfectly loved God the Son. But Jesus says that dying will not have the final word. Instead, after he lays down his life, he's going to take it back up again. And so now we have this idea of resurrection. And again, I've said this before, but this would have been mind-blowing to the Jewish audience because Jewish orthodoxy prohibited the idea that anyone was going to rise from the dead and be resurrected before the appointed time at the end of the world when Yahweh would raise people from the dead. But Jesus here is saying, I'm going to take my life back up again with the will of the Father. He dies so that he can rise again. Verse 18. No one has taken it, that being his life, away from me, but I lay it down on my own. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it back. This is the commandment that I have received from my Father. Okay, Jesus is going to be killed on the orders of free-acting human beings, right? Acting in their own wills. But this does not mean that he is not in control of the situation. In other words, the only reason that Jesus is going to die is because he and the Father are allowing it to happen. Right? If Jesus wanted to, we have this moment at the arrest of Jesus where Peter's ready to scrap. He's like, they're after you, Jesus. Like, it's time for fisticuffs. It's time for swords. And Jesus says, like, Peter, do you not think that if I wanted to, I could call down an army of angels and smite all of these men who have come to arrest me? I want this to happen. I am allowing this to happen. Why? Because it is the commandment my Father has given me that I have authority to lay my life down and authority to take it back up. Jesus is not simply a religious martyr, right? Because a religious martyr is helpless before their fate. Like, they're dying because of what they believe, but they have no power or choice in the matter. Jesus is choosing. He is an obedient son, a good shepherd, a willing sacrifice, laying his life down for his flock. Everything that's going to happen in Jesus' life, from his dying to his rising, has been planned and declared and is being carried out by the will of God the Father, working through God the Son. Jesus is the good shepherd who is sacrificed to save the sheep. Now we look at verses 19 through 21. We see the response of the crowd to Jesus' teaching in all of these verses where he's been using sheep farming as a metaphor. Verse 19, dissension occurred again among the Jews because of these words. Many of them were saying, he has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him? Others were saying, these are not the words of one who is demon-possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of those who are blind, can it? So the Jews are divided about what Jesus is saying. Now the first group, it sounds like they're making two charges against him. One, that he's demon-possessed, and two, that he's insane. But it's not actually a double-barreled charge. The insane charge proceeds from the demon-possessed one. In other words, they're saying Jesus is insane because he's demon-possessed. They don't see those as two separate things, right? So the reason Jesus is insane is because he's demon-possessed. The charge is that he's demon-possessed. And the other group, the second group, they say, yeah, but he did this miracle. And you guys couldn't disprove it. You tried to prove that he didn't do it, but he did. He opened the eyes of the blind. Why is this so significant? As you read through the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, whenever this idea of the demonic realm, right, the evil, demonic, spiritual realm comes up, it is always associated with negative effects in the world. Sickness, madness, disease, death, suffering, shame. All of these things are a result of the demonic influence on the world, right? And so whenever Jesus interacts with these things, he always cleanses them and restores them. Where a demon brings sickness, Jesus brings healing. Where a demon brings insanity, Jesus brings salvation and clarity of mind. In other words, demons never work for the good of someone. And it's very clear that the opening of the eyes of this blind man was a good thing for him. And so the crowd is like, this can't be the work of a demon. Maybe he really is the good shepherd he claims to be. What if he is the Messiah? All right, so hopefully you've been kind of following along so far with the image and the point that Jesus is making in this passage, right? That he is the good shepherd, and what makes him the good shepherd is that he's going to lay down his life in defense of the sheep from this mortal threat that they are facing. But the keen among you might have noticed that we never established precisely what the threat to the sheep is, right? Like, what is this existential mortal threat to the sheep that's so dangerous that the only way they can be spared from it is that Jesus dies, right? That he lays down his life. And the answer in the Christian worldview is really simple, but it's fascinating. I mean, it's God's righteous judgment. That is the threat, the mortal danger that is facing all of us, is God's righteous judgment. Well, this is something that I think modern Christians tend to really struggle with, right? Because we've cast this view of God both in popular culture and in a lot of our churches, and it makes God really small, actually. It's a God that's not immense, a God that's not powerful, a God that's not really the king of everything. And one of the things that we've lost in that is this sense of God's righteous judgment. And here's the thing, God's judgment is a good thing. Like, it is a good thing. It is one of the things that we should give thanks for when we're giving thanks to God. Okay, God, thank you for your judgment and your justice. And that's not something a lot of Christians do. And when you read the book of Psalms, I mean, that is key, giving thanks to God for his judgment and his justice. Right? It is God's right, it is God's duty as the creator and the king of the universe to punish the wickedness, unrighteousness, sinfulness in the world. And it's not as though God has justice and it kind of ebbs and flows in various degrees. Rather, this is something I've been picking up as I've been reading a book by A.W. Tozer called The Knowledge of the Holy. Rather, it's that God is just and that everything he does is perfectly informed by that justice. The same thing applies with God's love, right? It's not just that God has love in his heart or whatever, and that love ebbs and flows depending on the mood that God is in. Rather, it is that God is love, and that everything he does is informed perfectly by love. There's not an action that God takes that is not loving, and in the same way, there's not an action that God takes that is not just. And so since all of us have been found guilty rightly before God because of our sinful hearts, which lead us into sinful actions and bring wickedness and unrighteousness into the world, we are all then justly under God's righteous judgment. And it's not as though God can just simply ignore justice, right? And simply just choose to forgive us on that account, right? Because then he would not be just, and he would not be a God worthy of our worship. Right? A God that is not just, a God that does not bring judgment, is really not a God worthy of our worship. Because that means that God would be looking down at the world, right, and seeing all the unrighteousness, all the wickedness, all the sinfulness, all the evil in the world, and simply shrugging his shoulders and saying, well, it's okay. There doesn't need to be justice. There doesn't need to be righteousness. There doesn't need to be holiness. I'm okay with all of this evil that's being committed in the world. There doesn't need to be justice for it. Absolutely not. God has to bring his justice on that unrighteousness, on that wickedness, on that sinfulness. And yet, at the same time, God's express purpose revealed throughout Scripture is for human beings, sinful human beings, to be reconciled to him and to have relationship with him, right? Again, thinking back to our Foundations of Faith series, I talked about this common refrain that shows up over and over and over again throughout the story of the Bible, and it's, I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell among you. In other words, God desires, right, that humans would be reconciled to him, that we would once again rightly recognize him as our God, that our hearts wouldn't be twisted towards sin, and that as a result of getting new hearts, perfected hearts, restored hearts, that then we would be able to dwell in God's presence again forever and ever. And so this right here is the purpose of the death of Jesus. It both satisfies God's righteous judgment and justice, and then in so doing allows us to be reconciled to God. Because what happens in the death of Jesus is God takes our unrighteousness, our sinfulness, our wickedness, he takes it from us and he lays it onto Jesus. And then he punishes Jesus for it. I mean, he pours out all of his righteous judgment, all of his justice falls on Jesus. And then so the justice has been satisfied. Like, it's not that God wasn't just. Justice was satisfied. The judgment was poured out. And as a result of that, God then can take the righteousness of Christ and give it to us, so that we stand before God not in the unrighteousness that comes with our sinfulness, but with the righteousness that comes from Christ. And we can stand before him justified, and we can once again be his people, and he can once again wholly be our God without the sinful heart getting in the way, and we can dwell with him forever and ever and ever and ever. This is why Jesus is so obsessed with his death. It's because he believes, and I believe, that it is what will bring salvation to the people. It is what is going to ultimately accomplish God's perfect justice and God's reconciliation of humanity to himself. His death is what makes him the gate to abundant life. His death is what makes him the light of the world, which overcomes the darkness. His death is what allows him to be the bread of life, which feeds us and sustains us and leads us into this true, abundant, eternal life. And again, our response is the same as last week. We can either choose to believe Jesus, to believe the message that he's casting here, that he is fully willing, that he's laying down his life for us, that he's taking our unrighteousness, our sinfulness, he's taking it, he's being punished for it, and as a result, giving us as a free gift his righteousness to be reconciled to God, or we can reject it. Right? We can reject it. We can say, I don't think Jesus has actually done that for me. I don't think that's what he came on earth to accomplish. But if we do that, and if Jesus is correct in his vision of the world, then God's righteous judgment remains. And I'll leave us with that thought. Thank you all for coming again today. I'm excited for next week as we wrap up our I Am series by looking at Jesus' statement, I am the resurrection and the life. Hope to see you.